Hello there and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Wherever you are, whether curled beneath a blanket, resting on the edge of sleep, or simply winding down after a long and quiet day, I invite you to join me now for a gentle journey into the past. There's no rush and nothing you need to do. Just let yourself settle. Maybe light a small lamp or make a warm drink, something comforting, something simple. This is a story told not to teach or explain, but simply to share, like a conversation whispered softly between friends beneath the hush of stars. Tonight, we'll be drifting into a world far from the noise of now, a world of ink and candlelight, of quiet hands shaping words in silence, where monks once copied books by hand, and the margins held secrets only the stillness could reveal. If you find peace here, if these quiet wanderings soothe or keep you company, you are warmly welcome to like or subscribe, not out of duty, but only if your heart truly feels at ease in this little corner of calm. And if you'd like, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something beautiful about knowing we're connected across oceans and hours by something as soft as a story. So go ahead, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The bell does not wake you. You were already awake, lying still beneath the woolen blanket as the shadows in the vaulted dormitory softened from charcoal to pewter. Outside the narrow window, the sky is the color of soaked vellum, pale and bruised. Cold stone presses against your side through the straw-stuffed mattress. There's no sound except the slow breath of brother at helm in the next bed, and the whisper of fabric as you fold back your blanket. It is not yet lauds, but the others are stirring. You dress by feel, pulling your robe over your thin wool tunic, feet finding stiff sandals under the cot. The air bites your skin as you move, your breath a quiet cloud in the early chill. No one speaks. The silence is not a rule, just yet it is simply the way the day begins. You cross the cloister slowly, your fingers trailing along the cold stone wall. Somewhere to the east, a single cockerel begins to declare himself. A moment later, the bell tower answers, deep and hollow. The sound rolls through the courtyard, across moss-wet paving stones and the frozen garden where last year's leeks have withered into memory. This place, your place, is the scriptorium at St. Martin's Monastery, nestled against the fog-soaked hills outside Tours. You came here 2 winters ago, younger than most, brought by a cousin who said you had good hands. Not clever hands, just patient ones. You don't miss your old village, only the smell of rain on bark, and sometimes your mother's barley bread when the flour was fresh. But here, you have ink and silence and time, and that is enough. Lauds is quiet. Psalms drift upward like candle smoke in the chapel. The monk's voice is low and steady, not yet warmed into song. You stand in the rear, near Brother Callistus, who always smells faintly of beeswax and damp wool. He nods to you once, without turning. Afterward, you do not eat. It is a day of fast, as many days are. You drink water from the stone basin in the cloister garden, letting your hands linger in the icy bowl. Across the garden, a robin hops onto the frozen herb bed and then away again, vanishing into the low mist. The sun rises unseen, smothered by fog, but the light grows clearer. By the time you reach the scriptorium, your fingers are already stiff. The door creaks softly as you enter. Inside, it is dim and utterly still, the air scented with old parchment, dry wool, and faint smoke. The walls are thick, and the only heat comes from the dozen or so bodies within, bent like reeds over their desks. Candles flicker behind horn-shielded lamps. The windows are small, high, and framed with frost. You take your place at the long bench near the far wall, beside Brother Leofric. He is older, kind, mostly silent. His face is lined, but the lines deepen when he smiles, which he does when your fingers fumble with the parchment roll. You do not speak. You do not need to. Laid before you is a half-finished psalm in Carolingian minuscule, one of Alcuin's approved hands, so precise and regular it almost breathes. Your task is to continue the passage, letter by letter. Nothing more, nothing less. You begin slowly. The quill moves across the vellum, steady as prayer. Ink seeps from the tip a dark, iron gall solution, bitter in scent, brewed yesterday in the sacristy by Brother Aldwin. The moment the ink touches parchment, it darkens, biting slightly into the skin. You trace each letter as if carving a path across a field you must not disturb. Domini, eni inferior tua arguis me. You write in rhythm with the others, a chorus of scratching. Occasionally someone sighs or coughs, but the silence remains whole. There's warmth in this repetition, in the long curve of an the delicate flick of a descending P. You love the G most of all. It turns like a tiny curl of smoke. The morning passes slowly, gently, like oil poured from a jug. At mid-morning, Brother Leofric nudges your arm. You look up. He has broken a quill and raises it like a wounded sparrow. You offer him yours, then reach to the tools laid along the bench spare feathers, penknife, pumice stone, small cloth for drying. Your fingers are cold, but you remember the steps. You select a new goose feather, press it against your palm, then begin to shape it. Across the room, the illuminator young Brother Eoric grinds blue pigment with a moistened pestle. The stone bowl clinks softly with each motion. The scent of vinegar and dust lingers around him. He hums faintly off-key. His fingers are already stained with lapis. You wonder how much gold leaf they'll let him use today. The bishop is commissioning a new gospel, and rumor has it, this one will be sent to Aachen. You continue copying, eyes lowered, head bent. Occasionally, you blink and glance at the margin, where yesterday's note to yourself is still visible, a faint, thumb-smudged sketch of a curled fern. Sometimes, when the light is kind and your mind is quiet, you forget you are writing someone else's words. You forget that your name will never be written here. You forget the chill, the ache in your shoulder, the year that has passed since you arrived. You feel only the weight of the letter in your hand, the slow unfolding of ink into silence. The bell chimes again. You pause mid-stroke. The light through the high windows has shifted no longer pewter, but a soft silver, almost warm. Outside, the fog has lifted slightly. The walls still glisten with condensation, but there is light, and in it, the silhouettes of bare trees. You tidy your tools, close the inkhorn, roll the parchment slightly so it doesn't curl. Beside you, Leofric murmurs something that might be well done, or it might simply be time. You nod. In the refectory, the benches are cool beneath you, and the smell of lentils, onions, and boiled barley fills the air. The meal is plain, a ladle of thin stew, 2 slices of coarse bread, a cup of warmed ale. You eat slowly, chewing each mouthful as the reader recites a passage from Augustine. You do not listen to the words, only the cadence, the rise and fall of a voice moving through memory and thought. At the table's end, Brother Geraint spills a bit of ale on his robe. No one reacts. Across from you, Brother Eoric has a smudge of blue paint on his chin. You almost smile. You finish your bread. The final prayer is spoken. Hands fold. Heads bow. Outside, you walk once around the cloister. The garden is still bare. The ground is hard. The lavender bush has shrunk into itself, and the water barrel is rimmed with ice. But the sky is opening now, the clouds thinning to let through pale sun. It feels good on your face, even for a moment. You return to the scriptorium, not because you must, but because it is quiet, and you are not yet ready to stop. Inside, the warmth has grown slightly. A few candles have been trimmed. Someone has brought a brazier closer to the central desks. The air smells faintly of ash. You sit again, pull the parchment closer, and begin the next line. Miserere mei Domini. Mercy, a word like breath. The ink flows, and you with it. The bell for none is still an hour away, but the silence between bells is its own kind of prayer. You've returned to your place at the long bench, back straightened, fingers flexed quietly in your lap. The light filtering through the narrow windows has turned golden gray, thickened with the dust of motionless air. Outside, a breeze might be stirring the ivy, but here, the world holds its breath. The fire in the brazier at the center of the room crackles softly now, coaxed back to life by someone unseen during the midday pause. Its warmth reaches you in the faintest of breaths, enough to take the bite out of the stone beneath your sandals. Still, your toes curl against the cold inside your boots, woolen socks barely enough for a winter that has not quite loosened its grip. You unroll the parchment once more. The line you ended before the meal still lingers there, half finished, the ink dried to a rich brown. The iron gall has settled evenly, not feathered, not too light. It pleases you. You whisper the next words of the psalm beneath your breath before you begin, as if giving them permission to take shape in ink. Ne perdas anima meam cum impius. Do not destroy my soul with the wicked. The words settle into the skin of the page, one curve at a time. Around you, the scriptorium exhales into motion again. Brother Leofric has returned to his own line of scripture, the faint creak of his bench familiar and comforting. Further down, Brother Hrodgar rubs chalk along a new sheet of vellum, preparing the surface with steady, circular strokes. The chalk's dry hiss is almost like wind over leaves if you close your eyes. But you do not close your eyes. You write. Each letter is a rhythm, a quiet act of remembrance, a physical surrender to a thought not your own, yet familiar. The quill scratches softly over parchment that once belonged to a sheep, or perhaps a goat. You do not know its name, but you think sometimes that you would thank it if you could. Its life continues in this page. In your hand, midway through the sentence, your ink begins to thin. You pause, glance at the small horn cup beside you, and reach for the little stirring stick carved from bone. You dip it into the inky black pool, stir it gently, watching the tiny flecks of sediment lift and swirl like constellations. The smell rises from fermented bark, metal, and something faintly sweet. It smells of the earth, of things buried and retrieved. As you dip your pen again, Brother Eoric arrives at your bench. He does not speak. He simply lays down a tiny square of vellum, no larger than your palm. On it, a painted flower delicate, vivid, luminous as if caught in dawn light. It is a clematis, you think, or perhaps something imagined. The petals are the color of bruised lilac, the leaves rimmed with gold. You look up. He gives you a half smile, eyes bright behind their usual sleepiness. For the margin, he murmurs, voice barely more than a breath. I thought your page wanted company. You nod. You do not say that it made your chest feel warm in a way the fire never does. You do not say that you've always loved clematis vines, how they twist, climb, and curl like cursive. You simply touch the corner of the painting with your forefinger, just enough to feel the softness of the pigment. He walks away without waiting for thanks. You tuck the tiny painting into the fold of your robe, not to be added to your manuscript, of course, but to be kept for later. The hours pass without need for announcement. The sun, though unseen, moves across the sky and shifts the light in the room. It becomes softer, diffused through the horn windows like milk and water. Shadows grow longer along the flagstone floor. Quills scratch. Ink dries. Pages breathe into being. You glance across the scriptorium now and then, not out of distraction, but out of reverence. The slow ballet of hands and eyes and parchment. Brother Leofric pauses to trim a frayed edge with his knife. Brother Aldwin is pinching a roll of gold leaf with a sliver of bone and whispering something to it, as though asking it to be kind. You do not know what hour it is. You do not need to. When your hand begins to tremble, you lay down the quill. You roll your shoulders. Your back aches in the same place it always does between the shoulder blades, just where the weight of the world might rest if it were shaped like a psalter. You rise slowly, quietly, and stretch one leg behind the other. You do not leave the room, not yet, but you walk slowly past the other desks, past the half-finished pages, glowing with red ink and green vines, past a blank vellum sheet where someone has ruled faint lines and then simply stared. You pass the brazier, feel its hush of warmth on your robe, and then pause near the far end, where a window lets in the faintest breeze. Outside, the light has turned to amber. A cluster of crows settles into the bare branches beyond the cloister wall, shifting and muttering to one another. Their feathers gleam like spilled ink in the last of the sun. You rest your palms on the window's edge. The stone is cold, but not unfriendly. In the courtyard below, Brother Oswin is watering what remains of the winter herbs. He moves slowly, his shoulders stooped, the watering can old and battered. You watch as the stream falls into the soil, disappears, and leaves behind only dark earth and steam. He glances up once, sees you, nods. You return the nod. Sometimes that is enough. A few snowdrops have begun to appear near the edge of the path. They always come first, long before winter ends. You wonder what else will bloom this year, whether the bees will return to the garden wall, whether this year's manuscripts will travel to distant cities, held by noble hands that will never know yours. You return to your desk when your fingers feel warm again. One last sentence, one final line before the bell. You dip your quill, carefully this time, and steady your breath. You do not rush. There is no need. The letters flow again easier, gentler, like old friends returning from a long walk. When you finish, you close your inkhorn, brush away the crumbs of dried pigment from the edge of the page, and sit back. The candle beside you gutters slightly. The wick leans into the pool of wax like a tired monk resting in prayer. You fold your hands. You listen. In the stillness, someone turns a page. The sound is slow, deliberate, like the shifting of snow. And then, in the distance, the bell tolls. Not loud, not urgent. Just a reminder, the world continues. You rise. You will return for vespers soon. And perhaps after that, you will visit the kitchen to sweep the floor, or help prepare tomorrow's ink. Maybe Brother Eoric will show you his latest illumination an angel with rose-petal wings, or a lion's tail twisted into a vine. But for now, you walk slowly down the corridor toward the chapel, your hand brushing once more against the pocket where the painted clematis rests. The sky is pale gold. The day is not done, but is quiet, and that for now is enough. Vespers draws the light out of the sky. By the time you step into the chapel, the sun has sunk behind the western cloister wall, turning the stained glass window above the altar into a slow, burning amber. It's not a brilliant fire, not one that dazzles but a softened gold, as if the day itself is folding away its last thoughts. The psalms this evening come slow and unhurried, spoken more than sung. The chant slips around the stone pillars and brushes against the wooden choir stalls like breath against linen. You stand again in the back, your fingers tucked quietly into your sleeves, letting the words of David pass over you like distant waves. Your legs are tired, your shoulders ache, but this is the ache of good labor, the kind that comes not from strain, but from repetition. Familiar, ancient welcome. Afterward, you do not return immediately to the scriptorium. Instead, you step into the cloister walk, where the dimming sky still holds a trace of pink behind the leafless ash tree. The lanterns have not yet been lit. For a moment, there is only stillness. And then, from the kitchen garden, a low chuckle. You glance toward the sound and see Brother Oswin again, this time crouched near the wall, watching something with quiet delight. You step closer, careful not to make noise. He doesn't turn, but gestures softly with one hand. "Shrew," he whispers, barely audible. "Bold little thing." You follow his gaze. Near the base of a stone trough, a tiny, whiskered blur noses between frost-covered roots, sniffing at the crumbling edge of a stale crust someone must have dropped. Its fur glints silver in the evening damp. It scurries forward, then darts back as if second-guessing its bravery. You and Oswin say nothing more. Eventually, The shrew disappears into the shadows, and Oswin straightens with a sigh. "Lives boldly," he says at last. "No rule, no bell." Then he smiles and nods toward the walkway. "Come, the others will want the brazier stoked." Inside the scriptorium, the room is different now. Still familiar, still warm but changed. The air carries the scent of tallow and soot, mixed with the faintest edge of rosemary from Brother Geraint's robe. The lamps have been lit. Their glow gathers in pools, throwing soft halos on the stone walls and gleaming faintly on the metal nibs of tools. You take your place again at the bench, but you do not unroll your parchment. Evening work is optional, reserved for those who wish to finish a line, or who find silence more nourishing than sleep. Brother Leofric is there, but now with his spectacles balanced low on his nose, reading rather than writing. His lips move just slightly, silently repeating a line. His hand rests on a sheet filled with notes in tiny, practiced hand. At the far end of the room, Brother Eoric is painting again. He has propped the manuscript upright, a trick he sometimes uses to better see the glint of gold leaf against candlelight. His brow is furrowed in concentration, but his movements are still graceful, more like a prayer than a task. You breathe in deeply, and take up your quill not to continue the psalm, but to copy a favorite passage from memory. Something familiar, comforting, private. A line from Proverbs, perhaps, or a phrase Brother Leofric once recited during supper. "In quietness and in trust shall be your strength." You don't worry about the margins this time. You simply write. Slowly, carefully. You shape each letter like a gift. Halfway through the line, your quill snags on a rough patch. The parchment resists, then yields with a faint whispering sound. You pause, brush the spot gently with your finger. The skin was imperfect there, still carrying the trace of its living form, a memory of hide and movement. You smile faintly and begin again just above the mark, letting the imperfection remain. Even now, as the lamps flicker and the fire dims, the air in the scriptorium holds its strange clarity. It's not a physical clarity. There is smoke, dust, and the scent of oil, but a stillness of mind, a sharpness of presence. It is as if the words themselves quiet everything else. Across the room, Brother Eoric sighs. You look up and see him holding his brush madere, gold leaf, drifting gently to the table in a slow, fluttering fall. "I sneezed," he says mournfully. You suppress a smile. A fatal blow. He raises one hand, only to the margin. You rise, walk slowly to where he sits. The manuscript is open to an illumination St. Luke with his ox, surrounded by spiraling vines and fruit no one has ever seen in real life. In the corner, where a spiral once curved into a golden flourish, now there is a smudge. Not ruinous, just soft. "I liked it better that way anyway," you say gently. He laughs quietly, rubs his eyes. Then it's a divine correction. The two of you stand there for a moment in silence. The manuscript glows faintly in the lamp's reflection, and beyond the small window, the stars have begun to appear pinpricks in the dark, blurred slightly by the thick glass. Brother Eoric steps back from his desk and stretches, his joints creaking like old wood. "Walk with me," he asks. You nod. The night air is sharp, but the wind has calmed. You walk the cloister path together in slow loops, your footsteps hushed against the worn stones. The stars are brighter now, more confident, scattered across the black like silver filings. Somewhere in the distance, a sheep bleats, once from the pasture beyond the wall. A dog answers, then silence. Eoric walks with his hands behind his back, his breath forming small puffs as he speaks. "I think often," he says softly, "of where our work ends up, whether anyone reads it, or just looks at the pictures." You nod, but don't speak. He continues, "Sometimes I imagine a boy, somewhere in Lombardy or Saxony, tracing the letters with his finger, whispering the psalms aloud. I like that thought." You do too. You walk 2 more quiet laps before returning inside. In the dormitory, the lamps have been lowered. The air smells of beeswax and worn wool and the faint, lingering smoke of evening fire. You fold your robe neatly, lay it across the foot of your cot, and sit for a moment before lying down. The straw mattress creaks gently beneath you. The blanket is scratchy but warm. You tuck the clematis painting beneath your pillow, more for the ritual of it than necessity. From the bed beside you, Brother Leofric shifts. Stillness suits you, he says, barely audible. You smile unseen. Thank you, you whisper. Outside, a late wind rattles the shutter once, then quiets. The fire in the scriptorium will burn down soon, its last embers glowing softly under the ash. Your hands still carry the faint scent of ink. Your eyes still see the curl of each letter when you close them. Tomorrow you will write again, but for now you rest. And in the great hush of evening, the words you copied ancient, careful, whispered across centuries, rest with you. You wake in the dark, though you were never fully asleep. It is the sort of waking that comes without alarm, without urgency, just the gentle lifting of a veil. Your eyes open, and you find the world around you unchanged, dim, still, shaped by shadows. The air in the dormitory is cold again, colder than it was at Compline, and your breath rises faintly above the edge of the blanket. The silence is different now, not the expectant silence of morning, nor the respectful quiet of vespers. This is the deep silence, the silence that comes after everyone has stopped even thinking of words. You lie still for a time, listening. Somewhere in the distance, a roof beam shifts with a sound like a sigh. The wind outside brushes against the shutters, not knocking, just passing by. Beside you, Brother Leofric breathes slowly, deeply. His hands, you imagine, are folded beneath the blanket, the same way they are folded in prayer, without vanity or force. You feel no reason to rise, and yet you do. The straw mattress creaks under your movement, a sound loud enough in this silence to feel holy. Barefoot now, your feet find the flagstones one by one. Cold bites into your soles, but does not shock you. You've grown used to stone. You have lived with it long enough to know its quiet dignity. You do not light a lamp. The moon is out tonight, though hidden behind clouds. Enough light filters in through the narrow windows to shape the hallway in shades of silver and ink. You wrap your robe tighter as you pass through the corridor. No bell will call you until matins. Yet your steps are calm, steady, unworried. There is no rule against wandering in the night, though few do. Most rest until duty returns. But you tonight, you feel drawn to the cloister, to the garden held within the monastery's stone arms. You reach the door and ease it open. The night air greets you like an old friend, cold and smelling of turned earth, wet bark, and distant smoke. A thin layer of frost glistens on the flagstones, and the bare trees in the courtyard stand like black lace against the sky. The moon reveals itself just enough to catch the edges of things. A clay jar near the herb bed, a low bench, the tip of a spade left forgotten in the soil. You move slowly along the cloister walk, your fingertips brushing the moss-dark wall, trailing over grooves worn smooth by generations of quiet footsteps. The garden is not asleep. It is simply waiting. At the fountain in the center of the cloister, water still trickles. It has not frozen, though it is cold enough to feel like a memory of ice. You kneel beside it, cup your hands, and let the water pass through your fingers. It is clear, patient, without complaint. You listen. Far above, a single owl calls once, then again, its voice hollow and wise. You smile faintly. Somewhere in the roof beams, Yorick would say, the owl is watching us all, keeping the night in balance, judging the dreams of monks and mice alike. Your gaze turns upward, following the arches of the cloister arcade. The stars are faint tonight, wrapped in mist, but a few remain like the dots of an unfinished script across heaven's vellum. You sit back on the bench and breathe in slowly. It is here in this hour that the day begins to soften inside you. Your thoughts drift not quickly, not in any haste, but like petals in water. You remember the way Brother Eoric's gold leaf curled as it fell, the way Oswin spoke to the shrew as if to a wayward guest, the warmth in Leofric's voice before sleep. You recall the softness of the clematis painting beneath your pillow, the curl of its vine, the memory it stirred of your mother's garden. You hadn't meant to think of her tonight, but here she is, folded softly in your thoughts, her hands always warm, smelling of flour and crushed mint, the sound of her laughter during storms, when the roof would drip and the fire would sputter. You remember the way she would hum when kneading dough an old song no one else knew. You do not feel sadness, only distance, only time. The water in the fountain continues its whisper, saying everything and nothing at once. A shape moves at the far end of the walkway. You do not startle. You simply watch. It is Brother Leofric, his robe drawn close, sandals softly echoing across stone. He sees you, nods without speaking, and sits beside you on the bench as if he had always planned to do so. For a while, you sit in silence. Then, gently, he speaks. Restless, you consider the word. Not quite, you say. Not yet finished, maybe. He nods slowly, folding his hands in his lap. I used to come here every night, he says, especially when I was new. I'd listen to the fountain. I thought if I sat here long enough, I might begin to hear the voice of God. Did you ask? He smiles. No, but I heard my own voice again. After a while, that was almost the same. You sit with that thought. The wind stirs again, and the fountain answers. You have good script, Leofric says after a while, still watching the garden. Your minuscule breathes. You blink at that. I copy, you say. That's all. He turns to you, eyes calm. Copying is never just. You shape the word with your own hand. You give it flesh. You make it visible. Even silence, when copied well, becomes scripture. You feel his words settle into you like snowfall. Thank you, you say quietly. He rises then, with small groan of joints not used to cold benches. I'll leave you to your silence, he says with a half smile. But don't let it keep you. There's work tomorrow. Always. He disappears into the shadows, robes brushing the stone behind him. You remain a while longer. The moon has risen higher now, though still cloaked in haze. The frost on the paving stones glitters faintly under its light. The herbs in the garden are asleep, but still breathing. Somewhere the owl glides unseen. Somewhere else, a page waits to be written. You stand, stretch, and let your hands linger once more on the rim of the fountain basin. The water touches your fingertips again. It is colder now, almost sharp. You walk back the way you came, past the closed doors of the scriptorium, where tools rest on their benches, and ink sits dark and undisturbed in horn cups, past the lamp room, where the faint glow of stored candles flickers like dreams behind closed lids. In the dormitory, the air is warmer than before, or perhaps you have grown used to the chill. You slip under your blanket again, pull it up to your chin, and rest your hands over your chest. The clematis painting waits beneath your pillow. You do not reach for it. Just knowing it is there is enough. Your thoughts dim, soften, dissolve. In the stillness, you hear your breath. You feel the beat of your heart. You remember the words you wrote today. You remember the spaces between them. And then, gently, you sleep. There was a morning in spring clear, pale, and cool when Alcuin stood beneath the vaulted eaves of Aachene's palace chapel, listening to the muffled murmurs of stable hands and priests rise into the cathedral air. It was still early. The dew had not yet lifted from the marble steps, and a fine veil of mist clung to the gardens just beyond the arches, where violets bloomed in quiet corners near the hedges. The air smelled of damp stone, fresh bread from the nearby kitchens, and the faintest trace of incense left lingering from Prime. Alcuin stood still, wrapped in a simple wool robe that draped more heavily than the southern silks favored by many of Charlemagne's courtiers. He was older now, white in beard, bowed slightly in back, but there remained in his hands a gentleness, the kind that came from decades of script and psalm, the kind learned not in cathedrals, but in cloisters. A servant passed, bowed, and continued on without words. That pleased him. He liked to pass through the palace, not as a figure of power, though he could have claimed it, but as a shadow of thought, an idea moving through marble halls. Within, the royal court was beginning to stir. One could hear it in the rustle of embroidered cloaks, the low percussion of boots on tiled floors, the sound of brass being polished and documents being unrolled. In the distance, a falcon called from its perch on the palace balustrade. Its wings stirred against the morning breeze, feathers catching the early light like gilded ink on vellum. Alcuin exhaled softly and stepped inside. The Alla Palatina Charlemagne's chapel palace was a fusion of many worlds. Roman columns stood beside Frankish timber. Byzantine mosaics glinted above Latin inscriptions. It was, Alcuin sometimes thought, a physical prayer, part memory, part ambition. He made his way along the edge of the hall, passing beneath round-arched windows, past a mosaic of Christ enthroned, eyes solemn, gold halo flickering with reflected light. He found his place near the lesser seats, never among the high counselors, though the emperor had offered. Alcuin preferred the margins. That was where one saw most clearly. This morning, the emperor would listen to a reading, not from a cleric, nor from a diplomat, but from a boy young Hugo, son of a Lombard noble, barely 10, freckled and still uncertain in Latin declensions, but eager to please. Alcuin had taught him the psalms in small doses, woven through with riddles and stories, like honey laced into bitter tea. The boy stood now before the assembled court, knees locked, wax tablet clutched in two hands. His voice was tremulous, but steady. Bidica habitant in domo tua, Domini. Blessed are those who dwell in your house, O Lord. The line trembled in the air, innocent, fragile. Alcuin smiled faintly. The court did not stir. Nobles were not unkind, merely indifferent. Many could not read, not beyond their own names. Yet they nodded with appropriate solemnity, as if the words belonged to them too. Charlemagne himself sat in his high-backed chair, a lion carved into each armrest, his gaze fixed not on the boy, but on Alcuin. Their eyes met for a moment. The emperor's face so often seen in profile on coin and seal held no grandeur now, only stillness. He nodded once, a small gesture, then looked away. Alcuin inclined his head in return, barely perceptible. This was their pact. The emperor ruled in iron and law. Alcuin ruled in silence and script. Later, in the cloistered garden behind the scriptorium, Alcuin sat beneath a lime tree, parchment across his knees. He was not copying a psalm. Not today. Instead, he was writing a letter to Arno of Salzburg, or perhaps to Joseph the Irishman. The recipients changed, but the tone remained. Gentle counsel, quiet humor, the slow carving of thought into language. He believed in letters. They were footprints in ink, small bridges over distance and death. A breeze moved through the garden, lifting the corners of his parchment. He held it down with one hand, the other still holding his reed pen. Across the path, a novice monk swept fallen petals into a woven basket. The scent of crushed violets drifted upward. Bees buzzed lazily through time blossoms, and above them all, the cathedral's dome caught the sun like a polished chalice. He wrote, "To be silent is not always to be still. Sometimes the hand must move so the soul may rest." He paused. The emperor reads more now, slowly but with purpose. It pleases me to see his lips move when no one watches. Perhaps one day he will write as well as he speaks. He dipped his pen again, blew softly across the ink, and continued. In the palace library chamber, still small in those days, though growing, Alcuin later examined a scroll newly arrived from Ravenna, a fragment of Cicero's De Officiis, half-charred at the edges. The script faded to near ghost. He held it carefully. as one might cradle a child not yet awake. Another monk watched from the doorway, uncertain. Alcuin gestured him in. "We will copy this," he said simply. The monk nodded reverently. The idea that this text, once nearly lost, would live again, that some scribe in Tours or Reims or Metz would give it new form, was enough. Not for glory, not even for posterity, but for continuity, so that the thread would not break. The monk asked if it should be copied with glosses, or left plain. Alcuin smiled. "Add the glosses. The margins speak too." That night, as the palace grew quiet, Alcuin stood once more in the chapel. The oil lamps had been lowered. The mosaic Christ shimmered faintly above the altar, eyes turned neither toward judgment nor mercy but presence. The air was still, holding the scent of myrrh and old wood. He stood not in prayer, but in pause. Charlemagne had asked him once, after a long night of counsel and concern, what it was like to hold so many words in one's head. Alcuin had replied, "It is like walking beside a river. The words move, and I follow. I do not own them. I only watch." Now, standing alone beneath the vault, he thought again of that river, of how so many things slipped away. Kings, armies, cities. Yet words faithfully copied, carefully preserved remained. He touched the folds of his robe and felt the rough edge of a letter inside. A note from a boy in York, still learning his Latin, who had sent him a question. Is it true that letters can make the soul stronger? Alcuin had not answered yet, but in his heart the answer was quiet and sure. Yes. Outside, the wind rustled the lime trees. The stars hung like quiet punctuation above the palace roof. And somewhere in a distant monastery in Fulda or Tours or Corbier, a young monk dipped his quill in ink, unrolled a sheet of vellum, and began. In principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the word. The rain fell softly on the roof of the monastery at Tours. Not the kind of rain that lashes or soaks, but a gentle rhythm that settles into the timber and tiles like a breath returning home. It darkened the cloister stones, drew a shimmer across the flagstones by the scriptorium door, and filled the herb garden with the scent of earth and rosemary. Inside, the light was dim but steady. A long row of desks, lit by horn windows and 2 oil lamps, lined the walls of the scriptorium. No voices disturbed the room, only the hush of quills gliding, of parchment turning, of a low breath now and then as someone leaned close to their work. The smell of ink sharp with tannins, dark as midnight mingled with wax and wool and damp linen. This, Alcuin believed, was how empires should be built, not with banners and blades, but with pages, quiet ones, filled with letters that would outlast walls. He stood at the back of the room, hands folded behind him, robe loose over his shoulders. He was not reading, not correcting, only watching. The monks before him, some barely man, others gray at the temples, wrote with the steady diligence. They were not fast, but they were exact, and more importantly, they believed in the value of what they were copying. On the pages before them bloomed the Psalms, the Gospels, the letters of Augustine and Jerome, and among them now, more often, the voices of Cicero, Boethius, Pliny, and Virgil. Alcuin had introduced them cautiously, wrapped in commentary and gloss, presented not as pagan challenges, but as mirrors of truth, echoes, not oppositions. He watched as one monk paused to adjust his penknife, trimming a quill with the same delicacy a surgeon might give to bone. Another blew gently on fresh ink to prevent smearing. A third, younger scribe tapped his fingers just once on the edge of the desk before returning to his line. Alcuin made a note of that rhythm was important. Perhaps he would introduce more metrical texts next season. Outside, the rain kept falling. It had not always been like this. When Alcuin arrived in Francia, years earlier, the script had been chaos. Every monastery followed its own hand, dense Merovingian scrawls, uneven insular letters, cramped Roman revivals. Some sloped like wind-blown reeds. Others sprawled across the page, as if afraid of silence. He had found scribes arguing over the shape of a letter G, debating whether a T should descend or stand straight, whether a space was permitted between words. And so, with patient conviction, Alcuin began again. He simplified, standardized, curved the letters into friendly forms, round, open, breathing shapes. He introduced space between words, punctuation, consistency. He borrowed from the best of Roman capitals and the clarity of Northumbrian half-uncials. Then he taught others to teach it. This was not just style, it was strategy. A clear script was not only beautiful, it was legible. Across miles, across generations. He did not name the script after himself. He never would have. But others would, centuries later. Carolingian minuscule. The script that rebuilt literacy in Europe, one soft curve at a time. One afternoon, not long after the new script had taken root in the palace libraries, Charlemagne asked Alcuin a question. They were seated in the garden court at Aachen. The emperor held a sheet of freshly copied parchment in his broad, calloused hands. He squinted at it, lips pursed. "Why do you insist on these empty spaces?" he asked, pointing at the word gaps. "They are not empty," Alcuin said. "They allow the eye to breathe." The emperor grunted. In Rome, they wrote without pause, rows like bricks, words shoulder to shoulder. Soldiers, not dancers. Alcuin smiled. "And how often do you read their scrolls aloud without error?" Charlemagne gave a half-laugh. "Never," he admitted. Alcuin bowed his head slightly. "Even thoughts need room to rest, sire." There was a pause. A bee hummed between the thyme blossoms. The emperor touched the page again, then set it down beside him. "I want every monastery to copy like this," he said at last. "Every book, every school. No more crooked letters." And so it began. At Tours, Alcuin created not just a scriptorium, but a system. Each monk had a roll, some copied, some illuminated, some ruled lines, others prepared parchment. Ink was brewed in batches, tested for consistency. Mistakes were scraped away with knives, but seldom. Alcuin's method produced careful hands. Manuscripts were checked not once, but 3 times. Spacing, spelling, style. He taught his scribes that a text was not merely repeated, it was offered, given as if to God himself. Even the margins had meaning. In the hours between prime and sext, he would walk among them, offering advice gently, a hand on a shoulder, a question whispered beside a bench. "What is this flourish?" he asked once, pointing at a particularly ornate capital B. The scribe hesitated. "A vine, Master Alcuin." "A vine," he echoed. "And does the gospel require pruning or planting?" The scribe flushed and nodded. The next letter was simpler, stronger. He did not forbid creativity. Far from it. He understood that beauty was part of devotion, but he taught discipline first. Ornamentation should come after comprehension. "You do not gild a bell before it rings," he would say. And so the illuminators gilded after, and the bells rang true. There was a room in the monastery not large, not locked, where the finished manuscripts were kept. Shelves lined the walls, each fitted with narrow benches. Manuscripts were laid flat, not stacked, to protect the bindings. Some were wrapped in cloth, others left open, drying or still in revision. Alcuin came here often. He would walk the shelves slowly, fingertips trailing the edges of covers, murmuring the titles softly. De Civitate Dei, Epistolae Pauli, Regula Benedicti, Institutions Cassiodori. He thought of them not as objects, but as voices, some loud, some shy, some clear, others still learning to speak. Sometimes he would sit and open a book at random, not to read it fully, but to feel the shape of the text, the way the letters settled into the parchment, the rhythm of line endings, the breath between sections. It comforted him to see them, to know they existed now, that they might still exist long after he was dust. He once received a letter from a monastery in far-off Bavaria. It was short, simple Latin, a thank you for the new script. The abbot said it had made reading easier for the young. He enclosed a sample 3 lines of psalms, copied by a novice. Alcuin examined it. The spacing was uneven. The letters wobbled. The ink blotched at the start of each line. But it was readable, clean, honest. He smiled and wrote back the same day. Your lines may tremble, but they walk in the right direction. He knew that few would remember him. He knew that the books would bear no names, that the scribes would remain invisible, that most readers would never wonder who shaped their letters, who steadied their eye. He knew, and he did not mind. In a sermon once, he said, "He who teaches others plants orchards, he will never taste." It was enough. One winter evening, as snow fell soft outside the window, Alcuin stood once more in the scriptorium. Only one monk remained at his desk, finishing a column by lamplight. The others had gone to Compline. Alcuin watched him write the final word of a line, then pause. He leaned back, stretched his fingers. Then, after a moment, he smiled faintly and added something in the margin. A snail, maybe, or a flower, or a tiny hand in prayer. Alcuin did not correct him. The work was precise. The prayer was whole. Let the margin speak, too. In a stone room warmed by no fire, somewhere in the back corridors of the monastery at Tours, there stood a narrow shelf slightly crooked from age, worn smooth at its corners. Upon it rested 6 manuscripts, carefully spaced, their bindings darkened by time and touch. There was no label, no ornament, no glass to shield them, only silence. This was not the grand library where finished volumes were displayed for visitors or placed before bishops with polite ceremony. This was a quieter space, a working space. The manuscripts here were either incomplete, undergoing repair, or simply old. Not discarded, never that. Just retired. No one came here often, except Alcuin. On late afternoons, when the sun had turned the western windows to dim amber, he would sometimes walk the side corridor, past the drying room and the ink store, and step through the low arch into this quiet gallery of pause. He never said why. He never explained. The other brothers left him undisturbed, as if understanding without needing to be told. He would stand in front of the shelf for a while, hands folded or tucked into sleeves, eyes slowly reading each spine or where a spine might once have been. Then he would choose one, not always the same. One day a Psalter, another a tattered Gospel of John, sometimes a Carolingian grammar, written in a wobbly student hand from 20 winters ago. Sometimes one of his own revisions, though he never said so aloud. He would carry the chosen book to a low stool by the window and sit quietly, letting the light fall across the pages. He did not read them like a scholar anymore. He read them like one listens to a familiar voice, one no longer living nearby, but still close in memory. He knew which scribes had made which pages. He could feel it in the angle of a curve, the flick of a tail, the way a word leaned slightly into the margin. These were not anonymous works to him. They were hands he had once guided, shoulders he had once encouraged with a word or a nod. He did not say their names. He did not need to. In the monastic tradition, the scribe remained invisible. No signature, no self. The work was offered, not authored. Only rarely did a name slip in a tiny "Remember me, O Lord," hidden in the colophon, a single initial curled at the bottom of a page. Alcuin did not forbid these, but he did not encourage them either. He believed the reward lay elsewhere in the act itself. The pen was not a trumpet. The ink was not for praise. A scribe served something older, something longer than fame. When asked once why the scribes could not sign their names, he replied, "Because the work is already signed by time. That is enough." It was not that he lacked pride in them. Quite the opposite. He watched them copy texts with more care than many nobles gave to treaties. He saw their backs stooped in devotion, their fingers blistered from knife and feather, their lips moving silently as they formed each word. And when a book was finished, when it was bound, pressed, wrapped in wool, and laid gently upon the altar for blessing he bowed his head not in pride, but in quiet gratitude. "Another light for the long night," he would say. And the brothers understood. Not all manuscripts survived. Alcuin knew this, too. The damp could rot them. Rats could chew corners. War could scatter libraries into ash. Fire did not read Latin. He once walked through a monastery, years before, where a single smoking beam still smoldered beside a pile of charred scrolls. The abbot wept not for the building, but for a psalter copied in gold leaf that had taken one scribe 8 years to complete. 8 years. One book. Gone in an hour. Alcuin knelt in the ash, picked up a piece of burnt parchment, and read a single surviving word, miserere. Have mercy. He kept that scrap folded inside a prayer book until the end of his life. There was a peculiar irony in it all. The scribes spent their lives preserving the words of others. Saints, kings, poets, emperors. Their hands were faithful, their eyes strained, their nights long. Yet they themselves were written nowhere. A library made by ghosts. And yet Alcuin thought, wasn't that the point? To disappear into the work. To be remembered not by name, but by clarity. By the clean space between letters. By the ease with which a future voice could read the gospel aloud without stumbling. If your reader never noticed the scribe's hand, then the scribe had done his work. Years later, long after Alcuin's death, long after the palace schools had softened and new rulers had come and gone, the manuscripts remained. They traveled, quietly. Some crossed the Alps in wooden carts. Others were buried during raids and unearthed again decades later, dusty but whole. Some were torn, copied, and recopied. The original hand lost. The message still intact. In Ireland, a monk traced the new minuscule script into a psalter and marveled at its grace. In Italy, a student of medicine read Galen through a Carolingian lens and learned to write his notes in soft curves. In Spain, a scholar annotated Augustine in margins wide and clear spaces, made possible by Alcuin's reform. The words moved. The names did not. Today, in the libraries of Europe, Paris, Vatican, Vienna, London, you can still see them. The pages, the strokes, the quiet evidence of labor, so old it has outlived the bells that once called it to prayer. Some are displayed behind glass. Others sleep in vaults, waiting for careful fingers. Scholars peer at them now with microscopes and software. They count strokes, trace pigment, name hands they cannot name. They say, this was likely a monk from Tours, c. 800. They say, the hand is influenced by Alcuin's circle. They say, the script shows mastery, though the scribe remains unknown. Of course he does. And yet, if you look closely, if you allow yourself to linger over the curl of a G, the arc of a line, the spacing of the words, you may feel something else. A presence. Not loud, not seeking. Just there. A breath held on the page. A quiet offering from someone who once sat in wool robes beside a cold window, scratching letters into skin while the rain fell on the stones outside. Someone who asked for nothing in return, except perhaps this, that the light would last a little longer, that the words would reach you, that you would read them softly. And remember, by the time the lilacs bloomed again in Tours, Alcuin no longer walked as far or as often. He still rose early, still attended the quiet rhythm of the monastic hours, but his steps were slower now, measured, careful, softened by age and by years of ink, prayer, and parchment. His joints protested the cold in the flagstones, and the skin on his hands, once firm and calloused from trimming quills, had grown thinner, like vellum worn smooth by constant touch. He welcomed it, not with pride, but with a gentle kind of amusement. After all, he had written long ago that time is the slow scribe of the soul, and now he saw how it worked, inscribing patience into posture, and quiet into the face. He still carried a tablet with him most mornings, slate-backed, with chalk bound and linen thread, though these days he wrote less. Sometimes a name, sometimes a verse remembered in fragments, sometimes nothing at all, just the shape of a single letter, drawn again and again until it felt like breath. The scriptorium remained his favorite place, even as his hours within it shortened. He would sit on a low bench near the fire, hands folded, watching as the younger monks copied lines in careful strokes. He rarely corrected them, now others did that, but his presence steadied the room. Even the new novices wrote straighter when he was there, sensing without quite knowing that this quiet elder in the shadowed corner had once reshaped the very shape of their script. Occasionally, one of them would bring a folio to his lap, a psalter, perhaps, or a homiliary with fresh illuminations. Alcuin would trace the margins with his fingers and smile faintly at the color choices, saffron and indigo, carefully laid, sometimes almost too bold. "The letters are fine," he would say, "but remember, it is silence that gives the meaning." They would nod, unsure if it was praise or instruction. It didn't matter. The work would continue. The fire would crackle. The pages would turn. The rain would tap at the shutters, as it always had. In the late afternoons, he preferred to sit in the small herb garden beside the apothecary, beneath the quince tree that had outlived two abbots. The bees had returned by then, darting between the violets and thyme. He liked their humming. It reminded him of scribes reading aloud under their breath. A stool had been placed there for him, simple, low, and warm from the sun. Sometimes Brother Geraint would bring him a folded cloth to sit on. Other times, a fig or a cup of milk. They no longer asked if he needed anything. They simply gave. That was how things worked now. He wrote fewer letters. One to the Bishop of Orleans, thanking him for a shipment of parchment. One to a monk in Fulda, who had sent a copy of Der Institution Clericorum. And one, quietly and without ceremony, to the emperor. The handwriting was slower than before, a little uneven, but clear, to the great Charles, who rules not only with the sword but with the book. The strength of a king lies not only in his victories, but in what he leaves that cannot be stolen. I have planted many letters. Others will harvest them. That is the order of things. Keep the schools. Protect the scribes. Teach the sons of your nobles to love silence. And when the time comes, be generous with your forgetting. The world forgets what it must. Let it. What remains will be enough. He did not expect a reply. He did not need one. Toward the end, the brothers brought him books to bless. Not ceremonially, there was no right for it, but as a gesture, a custom. One by one, the newly finished volumes were laid on the table before him. Gospels, hymnals, letters, psalters. Some bore illuminations, others simple text. Some were his own teaching copies, recopied by hands he would never know. He would rest his hand on the cover, close his eyes, and whisper the same phrase each time. May the reader find more than the writer intended. It was his way of letting the book go. In those final months, his dreams became quieter, too. Not visions or revelations. He had never claimed such things, but small remembrances. He dreamed of York, of wet stones and geese on the river, of the taste of spring onions, the feel of chalk on his thumb, of a small boy sitting beneath an elm tree with a book too large for his lap, reading aloud to no one but the grass. Once he dreamt of the scriptorium at Aachen, but not of the emperor, or the palace, or the mosaic of Christ above the dome. Instead, he saw only a bench, empty, waiting, with a quill laid across it. He remembered waking from that dream with a feeling not of loss, but of return. It was not unexpected when he fell ill. There was no drama, no collapse, simply a slow, deep fatigue, the kind that settles first in the bones and then in the breath. He took to his cot earlier each day. The others checked on him, brought broth, rearranged the pillows. "Only a pause," he said once, with a faint smile. Even scribes rest between lines. Brother Leofric sat with him most evenings, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes not. The silence suited them. when they spoke. It was only of simple things, whether the plum tree would bloom, whether the candlestock would last through Lent. Once, Leofric asked him quietly, "Do you fear anything now?" Alcuin shook his head. "No, only that I may not finish the last word cleanly." He did in the end, on a rainy day in May, with the bees sheltering under the eaves and the garden thick with damp. The brothers found him in his bed, breath slow, eyes closed. One hand rested on a folded sheet of parchment. It was blank, not from failure nor forgetfulness, but as if he had left space for something else. He was buried behind the scriptorium, near the quince tree, in soil still rich from old manuscripts returned to the earth. The rain let up for just an hour as the bell rang once, twice, 3 times. There was no eulogy, only the prayers of the office, and a pause afterward that lasted longer than usual. In the scriptorium that evening, a new monk began a new line. He dipped his quill, set it to the page, and began in a script Alcuin had once shaped. The words were not his, but the space between them was. The manuscript is nearly perfect. The vellum has been scraped smooth, burnished to a dull shine. The script flows in steady columns, Carolingian minuscule, exact and quiet, shaped by a practiced hand. The psalms march gently from line to line, their Latin verses whispering across the centuries, like prayer caught in a breeze. But in the lower corner of the folio, beneath Psalm 118, there is a rabbit, not written, not named, drawn, inked in brown, the lines feathered just enough to suggest fur. Its ears are long, its back feet are impossibly large, and it is holding a tiny sword. No caption accompanies it, no explanation. It faces left, toward the margin's edge, as though prepared to leap into the whiteness beyond. Above it, the words, Fiat misericordia tua, Domini, supernumbers. Let your mercy, O Lord, be upon us. No one knows who added the rabbit. The script above is smooth, formal. The drawing, by contrast, is looser as if done quickly, not carelessly, but with a kind of freedom the text does not permit. It does not seem out of place, though. It simply is. A small presence. Unexpected. Unexplained. It is not the only one. In a different manuscript, copied sometime near the year 810, a scribe paused in the middle of a decorative border and added a snail. Coiled, deliberate. The shell is large and dark, the antennae flicked upward as if in question. A few lines later, another snail appears. This one is in motion. At the corner of the page, a knight crouches in full armor, sword raised. The snail faces him. They are caught, mid-confrontation, or perhaps mid-greeting. No narrative survives, only the silence between them. Elsewhere, in the margin of a Benedictine homiliary, a fox is drawn wearing a cloak. It holds a sack over one shoulder and appears to be walking upright. Its face is turned back toward the center of the page, as if wary of being seen. Just above, the text describes the binding of Isaac. The fox says nothing. It is only passing through. These images are found throughout the manuscripts of the Carolingian world. Not many, not loud, but enough. Enough to suggest that the margins were not empty, not always. Enough to suggest that beneath the smooth surface of scripture and rule, there lived something else. Something playful, subtle, wordless. A thread of quiet invention, left like a footprint in snow. Imagine a scriptorium, winter-lit and silent. The candlelight flickers. A scribe leans over his work, the nib of his quill moving in rhythm with breath. He copies the epistle to the Romans slowly, carefully, pausing now and then to blow gently across the ink. Outside, the snow begins again, tiny flakes settling into the moss between the stones. The bells have not rung in some time. The others are asleep or praying or watching the fire. And the scribe, feeling the quiet settle into his hands, turns to the edge of the page and draws a fish with wings. It curls on the margin like a smile. No one sees. No one asks. He returns to the epistle. The fish remains. Why? There's no answer in the texts. No mention in the rule. No apology or defense. They are not part of the scripture. But they are not accidents either. They are too careful, too precise. Some are whimsical mice playing lutes, cats with books, dogs wearing hats. Others are stranger. A man with the legs of a bird. A tree with hands instead of leaves. A monk with his mouth sewn shut. All rendered with the same ink, the same steady line. As if they belonged there. As if they, too, were a kind of scripture, just not one written in words. Some think they were drawn during pauses, between one psalm and the next, when the ink needed to settle, when the mind wandered, when the heart, full of verses, needed room to stretch. There are signs of hesitation in the drawing's places where the hand retraced a line, or shaded an ear, or gave a bird too many feathers. Not corrections, just lingering in the corner of a world built on silence. Once, in an old monastery along the Loire, a folio was found with an image of a monk asleep at his desk. His head rests on a manuscript. A quill droops from his hand. Above him, a small angel hovers with a candle. The text nearby is untouched, perfect, formal. But in the drawing, the monk's face is peaceful, almost smiling. No name, no caption, no meaning, only presence, only sleep. Some of the images fade now, ink leached away by time, pigment cracked by damp, insect tracks across the margin like new calligraphy. But others remain. They surprise the reader. Not loudly, not as intrusion, but as interruption, as a breath, a moment of soft confusion in the middle of holy precision. They do not ask to be understood, only noticed. There's no record of debate about them, no counsel condemning their inclusion. Perhaps they were simply too small to matter, or too private to challenge. Perhaps no one wanted to ask why a camel was drawn dancing beside Psalm 27. Perhaps everyone already knew. In the monastery at Tours, long after Alcuin's death, the scribes continued. The benches remained. The tools changed little. The script held steady. And the margins still held their surprises. A hedgehog with a basket of fruit. A woman with the tail of a fish. A single leaf curled into the shape of a sleeping lamb. No notes. No names. Only the quiet of 1,000 unnamed hands moving across centuries. And once, in a book of hours found in the ruins of a chapel, there was an image scratched lightly into the edge of a blank page. Not part of the text. Not even a proper margin. Just a space someone had left untouched. In the corner, 2 eyes. A mouth. A smile. Barely there. Almost erased. But not. Still watching. Still waiting. Still here. The rain falls again. The ink dries. The page turns. And the margins once more go quiet. There's a smell that lives in old rooms. Not dust. Not rot. Something finer, quieter. It clings to vellum and stone. It rises from candle soot, from drying ink, from the soft rub of wool sleeves against benches worn smooth. It is the scent of repetition, of ritual, of hands moving carefully in the same space, in the same silence, for a very long time. In the scriptorium, it lingers, not as presence, but as echo. Each day begins the same, not by bell, but by breath. A monk walks in, his robe still cold from the night air. He sets his tools on the table slowly, one by one, not out of ceremony, but out of instinct. The quill, the knife, the bone stylus, a horn cup of ink, a square of cloth, folded thrice, a fresh sheet of parchment, pale and wide. The light has not quite reached the window yet, but the page is waiting. The knife comes first. He draws it gently along the edge of the quill, carving the tip into a sharp, obedient angle. He shaves the point with the precision of someone who no longer thinks about the motion. The feather falls in fine curls to the floor, white and weightless, like snowfall without wind. He tests the nib with a touch to the parchment. The mark is faint. Good. It must not bleed. Then the ink. The cup holds a pool so dark it appears solid. A deep brown black made from iron salts. crushed gall, a little wine and thyme. It has steeped for days. It smells faintly of rust and resin, sharp at the edges. He stirs it with a sliver of twig. Gently, no haste. The sediment must rise just enough to bite. Then he dips the quill, and the day begins. Each letter is a motion, each word a breath. Not because he is reading aloud, he does not need to, but because the rhythm of language is carried in the wrist, in the weight of the line. He does not rush. There's no reason to. Time is not something to be spent here. It is simply the space in which the script appears. The parchment is not paper. It is skin, once goat or calf or sheep, now stretched, scraped, soaked in lime, rubbed with pumice, smoothed with chalk. It holds the memory of life in its faint patterns, the ripple of vein, the suggestion of fur. It is never fully silent. It creaks slightly beneath the quill. It shifts with temperature. It does not forgive mistakes. The monk has learned its ways. He listens to it. He knows which sheets will accept ink without resistance, and which will warp or wrinkle or push back. Sometimes a page will curl slightly at the edge, as if trying to remember wind. Sometimes the ink will pool in a tiny scar, and he will pause, press a cloth to blot it, then go on. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is perfect. He rules the page with the stylus-thin grooves, almost invisible, lines to guide the script, margins to hold the breath. He works from top to bottom, left to right, but not as a clock moves. More like water, slowly, with rest in between. He lifts his eyes, often not in distraction, but in rhythm. There's space between every phrase. Space to see. Space to hear the silence. Sometimes he draws a small mark in the margin, a flourish, a vine, not for decoration, just to keep his hand honest, to remember beauty. Once long ago, he drew a bird beside the opening letter of a prayer, a robin, perhaps, a single line. It is still there, decades later, a red dot for the eye. No one has asked him why. At midday, the parchment dries. The ink settles. He covers the page with cloth to protect it from dust and damp. Outside, the bells call to sext. The sunlight moves across the floor in pale bands, warming the cold spots where no fire ever quite reaches. The air smells of old wool, of soot, of rosemary from the cloister garden. He stretches his fingers. His wrist aches. He says nothing. He simply stands, folds his cloth again, and walks slowly out. On another day, another monk begins with pigment. His desk is smaller, crowded with shells and bowls, brushes and powders, mortar and pestle, a strip of gold leaf like thin flame. He grinds azurite with gum arabic and a bit of egg white. He leans close to the parchment, steadying his hand with a breath. He dots the eye of a lion. The color blooms, dark and deep and improbable. He says a quiet word, not to the lion, but to the silence. It listens. These are the rituals. They are not written down. They are passed by presence, by repetition, by the slow, unspoken transfer of understanding. A young scribe watches an elder stir ink 3 times to the left before writing. He does the same, not knowing why. A brother sharpens his quill with a certain angle of pressure. Years later, his pupil holds the knife the same way. A fire is lit early on foggy days. A bench is never moved from its corner. A certain psalter is always copied first. No one instructs this. No one questions it. The page remembers. And then there is the silence. More than the lack of talk. It is the medium in which the script exists. It is what remains after the knife is set down, after the ink dries, after the candle burns low. It is what makes the letters visible, and what keeps them company after the scribe is gone. Sometimes a page arrives from another monastery, a gift, or a commission, or a copy of something older still. The handwriting is different, the spacing, the ink, the spirit. The scribe sets it beside his own work. He does not compare. He reads it with his fingers. He feels the curve of the quill, the weight of breath behind each stroke. He does not know the scribe's name, but he knows the hand, the rhythm, the patience. They speak the same quiet. They have never met. They never will. Still, they understand each other. There is a sheet in the library, a single page from an incomplete text. No one remembers who copied it. It contains only one sentence. Fiat lux. Let there be light. The ink has faded. The letters lean slightly left. There is no margin, no commentary, no drawing, just a line, just a page, just the silence around it. And perhaps that is the point. Not the ink, not even the words, but the space in which they dwell. The slow, careful way a hand shapes meaning in silence. The smell of vellum in winter. The way a candle flickers at the edge of the page. The faint scratch of the quill. The breath between sentences. The weight of things that are made, line by line, and left unnamed. And the long hush that follows. Somewhere in a stone-walled room at the edge of the cloister, beneath shelves bowed under jars and folded cloths, there lies a bundle of parchment, loosely wrapped in a strip of old linen. Inside it, folded with the slow care of habit, is a list. The ink is faded. The script is informal rounded, leaning slightly right. The hand of someone practical rather than poetic. It is not a holy text, not a record, not even a complete set of instructions. Just a string of words, items, notes, gaps between them, smudges where fingertips turned the parchment over and back again. O galls, dry iron filings fine, a wine dark ash from grapevine, let rest 3 days, strain through cloth, add honey a little, that is all. No quantities, no explanations, no names. And yet once this list made ink, ink that shaped gospels, ink that traced the loops of the letter, in a quiet scriptorium, ink that dried in long ribbons across vellum, darkening slowly, whispering things no longer spoken aloud. The recipe remains. The hands that knew it do not. In the corner of the ink room, there's a scent that never leaves. Even when the jars are sealed. Even when the fires have gone out. Even after 100 years. It smells of vinegar and bark. Of stone and wet metal. Of mold and heat and memory. The scent of ink-reel ink is not sharp. It lingers low. Earthy. As if drawn from beneath the roots of a tree. It never smells the same twice. It depends on the air, on the mood of the wine, on whether the gall nuts were harvested before frost or after, on whether the monk stirred it with the right wood, on whether he was praying when he did so. The ink remembers all of this. It darkens accordingly. In another jar, half forgotten on a high shelf, sits a nugget of pigment the size of a plum pit. Wrapped in beeswax, nearly black, though if you rub it on cloth, it leaves behind a red, so deep it could be mistaken for blood. No one remembers what it was made from. A note on the jar, flaking away, reads simply vermis, worm. It may have come from crushed cochineal beetles, or roots boiled for hours, or a mistake something left too long over the flame. But once, it was used to illuminate a capital L. That page still sits in the library, the red line bright and soft at once, like a wound that has already begun to heal. They kept many pigments. Some were stored in walnut shells, sealed with wax. Some dried into cakes, and were scratched back into life with spit and hope. There was green from malachite, ground until it felt like flour. Blue from lapis lazuli, sifted into clouds and weighed like silver. Yellow from saffron, used sparingly too precious to waste. There was gold, too. Gold that came in thin sheets, thinner than breath, laid with a rabbit hair brush, pressed with a finger, sealed with a whisper. It never dulled. Not truly. Even now, when the manuscripts sleep beneath glass in dark rooms, the gold waits. Quiet, patient, alive. No one wrote down all the recipes. There was no central book, no codex of color. They were passed by memory, by eye, by taste. This should smell like bread left too long near the fire. This must feel like river mud, not garden clay. This red is too sharp. Let it sit until it forgets itself. And so the monks learned to read color not in language, but in experience. The blue that came on sunny days was different from the blue made in winter. The ink stirred after vespers ran slower across the page. The gold leaf laid during fasting cracked more easily than that set on feast days. They accepted this. They worked with it. They did not try to make the colors obey. Sometimes, when the brothers finished their copying for the day, they would sit beside the fire and scrape dried ink from the inside of old pots. It flaked like bark. They would crush it again and try to rehydrate it with warm water and patience. The revived ink was never as strong as before, but it was still ink, and sometimes that was enough. One winter evening, a monk set out to make a batch of red pigment. He ground the beetles too finely. He boiled the mixture too long. The color turned strange muddy, like wine left in the sun. He stared at it for a long while. Then he smiled, reached for a new quill, and wrote a single word on a scrap of waste vellum de Zeno. I stopped. He folded the scrap, set it beside the pot, and left it there. It was found centuries later in the spine of an unrelated book. The red was still there, dull but intact. Not all pigments were sacred. Some were playful. At the corner of a Carolingian psalter, someone painted a pea-green frog, sitting beside an initial Q. No one knows why. No other frogs appear in the text, but the paint has held, bright as moss, through damp and dust and forgetting. The margin did not reject it. The page, as always, made room. There are stories that speak of a blue so rare it could only be made from crushed lapis mined in the Far East, that it was carried on ships, traded for wool, stored in locked chests, that a single ounce could cost the same as a cow. And yet, in a manuscript copied by a nameless monk in the scriptorium at Tours, the blue is used to trace the veins of a vine curling between verses. No reason, no instruction, just a gesture, as if to say this, too, can be holy. Over time, the pigments fade. The ink blurs. Even gold grows tired, but not all at once. Some pages still shine when held to the light, their letters humming softly beneath the sheen of oil and breath. Others are half erased, the words ghosting beneath fingerprints and forgotten rubrics. But the memory of the color remains, even when unseen, even when unnamed, even when only the page remembers where the red once lived. And in a drawer at the back of the apothecary, beneath bundles of dried sage and powdered eggshell, there is still a note. No parchment, just a strip of linen, stained at the edges. It reads, in a hand so faint you must tilt it toward the sun to read. Use the good black, the one from the storm day. There's no date, no signature, but someone once knew exactly what that meant. The recipe is gone, the storm long past. The ink, perhaps, was used on a page that no longer survives, but the instruction remains. Soft, simple, enough. There's a sound that lives beneath the others. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It moves slowly, like breath in a long corridor, like footsteps through snow. It waits in corners, behind shutters, between the folds of cloth and the edges of silence. It is the sound of listening. And in the scriptorium, where the hours stretch long and the work follows breath more than clock, this sound has always been present, not as noise, but as presence. At first, all seems still. You enter the room early just after prime. The shutters are half open, and the pale gray of morning leans gently against the stone. There are no voices, no bells, only the small stirrings of another day beginning its slow unfurling. Then quietly it begins, a brush of woolen sleeves against a bench, the soft creak of which shifting beneath a familiar weight, the first rustle of parchment as it is unrolled with care, a distant cough, quickly muffled, a whispered word domini, a match strikes, hidden behind a hand, as a lamp is lit with practiced ease, and then the true beginning, the first stroke of the quill. The sound is not sharp, not hurried. It is like a moth brushing glass, Like rain beginning on slate. It repeats. It continues. It shapes the day. They say the rule is quiet, but is not silent. In the monastery, every hour is measured by sound. The bell is the first voice, a call from beyond the page. Its tone is round, not high. It does not command. It simply reminds. Then comes the murmur of sandals in stone hallways. Then the murmur of prayer. Not chanted, not yet only murmured. Psalms repeated with breath still thick from sleep. No harmonies, no flourish, just rhythm. Steady, low, words known by heart. Domini, labia mea apris. O Lord, open my lips. You hear it every day. And yet it always sounds a little different. Like wind changing its direction, just slightly. In the scriptorium, the sounds settle into their own rhythm. You hear the breathing of the scribe beside you. You hear the occasional lift and set of a cup warm wine, thin broth, rainwater from the basin. You hear the dull tap of the knife as it trims a quill. And between every small act, you hear the space that holds it all. The pause, the waiting, the music made not by melody, but by repetition. A silent liturgy, a script of sound. There's an old scribe who hums as he works. No tune, just a thread of sound. It trails behind him as he moves from desk to desk, warming the air with something that is not quite a note, not quite a word. The others say nothing, but when he's absent, the silence feels heavier, as if the pages themselves are listening for him. Some say the scriptorium teaches patience, but it also teaches hearing. Not just the hearing of instruction or of liturgical reading, but the kind of hearing that notices when someone stops moving too suddenly, when a quill breaks too often, when the sigh that leaves a mouth is not because of tiredness, but something else. No one comments. They do not need to. They let the sound settle. They let it rest, like ash on an old stone. The illuminator at the far bench keeps a string of bells by his pigments. No one remembers why. They are small, so small they almost vanish among his brushes and powders. But now and then, as he reaches for his gold leaf, the string shifts, and the bells chime. Not loudly, not clearly. A shimmer, a breath, like metal dreaming. One evening, after Compline, a young novice stayed late. He sat beside his half-finished page, the light of the single candle casting a warm pool around him. The other brothers had gone. The wind stirred softly through the high windows. He was not writing, just listening. To what? He couldn't have said. The wind, the fire, the parchment breathing. He placed his hand flat on the desk, closed his eyes, and for a moment, everything was still. He never told anyone about it. But the next day, in the margin of his folio, a line appeared, barely inked, a swirl that looked like a spiral of air. He did not speak of it, but he left it there. The scriptorium is not a place of invention, not in the usual sense. It is a place of return, of repetition, of the same word, the same line, written again, copied again, read again. Yet no two sounds are quite the same. No 2 days hold the same silences. Even the rain on the roof comes differently. In the dead of winter, when the lamps are lit before noon, and the air feels heavy with wool and breath, the sounds change again. More muffled, more fragile. The ink flows more slowly. The parchment stiffens. The knives slip more often. But the rhythm remains, even in cold, even in shadow, even when no one is speaking. There is a song that is never sung aloud. You hear it when the scriptorium empties, when the candle is almost gone, when the inkpot sits closed beside the parchment and the air has grown still. It is the sound of what remains, of hands long gone, of thoughts that passed like breath. It lives in the benches, in the windows, in the memory of quiet, long after the pages are bound, long after the scriptorium is dust. The sound remains, not heard, but felt, a shape of listening. It begins with warmth, not the kind one earns from walking a long path or sitting beside a hearth, but a curated warmth woven into the thickness of the tapestries, sealed within polished stone floors, pressed beneath cloaks trimmed with sable and fox. The chamber is large and quiet. The walls are lined with smooth columns, brought from far-off Ravenna. Beneath their shadows, silk cushions rest in formal stacks, soft as bread left to rise. A brass brazier in the corner breathes slow coils of heat, perfumed with resin and orange peel, and the air still and expensive, smells faintly of cloves. This is the private chamber of a noblewoman in the Carolingian court. Her name does not matter here. It has already been written in the family cartulary, embroidered into the hem of a ceremonial veil, whispered by servants in doorways. For now, she is simply present seated at the low window bench, wrapped in wool dyed with madder root and holding, in both hands, a folded letter she has not yet opened. The window before her looks out over the inner courtyard of the palace complex at Aachen. Its view is careful, too. Clipped hedges, a marble fountain, two peacocks asleep beneath the winter branches of a pear tree. There are no poor here. No monks copying by candlelight. Only the echo of power, flattened and formal. Behind her, a maid waits with a shallow basin of warmed rose water. The scent drifts up gentle, bruised, familiar. Shall I? The noble woman does not reply. She simply lifts her hands, and the maid moves forward. This is how the day begins. She rises before the chapel bell, though not for prayer. Her mornings are occupied by ritual layered fabric, braided hair, the application of civet oil to the wrists, a slow meal taken in near silence. Everything is prepared for her. The bread is cut thin and toasted over a silver tray. The butter, brought from a distant estate, is stamped with a family crest. Even the boiled eggs are sliced with a knife, so sharp it can trim candlewicks. No one eats for hunger. They eat because the hour demands it, because servants must be given something to do, because a table must not remain empty. She is not alone in the palace. In adjoining rooms, others perform their own quiet pageants. A nobleman dresses with the help of two attendants, one for his sleeves, one for his boots. A steward reads aloud a land dispute between distant cousins. Someone spills wine on a waxed letter. A boy, meant to be educated, doodles in the dust between floor tiles. A priest arrives to say something soft. No one listens, but the priest is thanked. At midday, the emperor himself appears not abruptly, but as the sun enters the south-facing corridor, warming the mosaic tiles just enough to make their gold flecks glimmer. He walks with measured gravity, his cloak trailing on the ground behind him, heavy with embroidery. His presence is not dramatic. He is not angry or laughing or giving orders. He is simply observed. Wherever he stands becomes the center of the room, not because he speaks, but because others wait to speak to him. He speaks rarely, eats slowly, writes not at all, though he keeps a stylus tucked into his belt, and it is said that he sleeps with it beneath his pillow. This is not for writing. It is a symbol, and symbols are what this place is made of. They are the library in the palace. It is small. Its shelves are lined with leather-bound volumes illuminated, commissioned, rarely opened. The books are kept clean by boys with feathers, who dust each folio as if it were an heirloom glass. The nobles glance at them, sometimes. They admire the gold lettering. They praise the clarity of the script. They do not read them not in the way a monk reads, hunched and quiet, chewing each word like barley. Here, reading is a performance, a way to be seen doing something thoughtful. A noblewoman may rest her hand gently on the open page of a missal and recite the psalm she memorized 10 years ago. A courtier may point to a passage in Augustine and say, "Yes, I've always liked this one." But the meaning is not in the text. It is in the gesture. When the bishop visits, they offer him a psalter copied by monks from Tours. It is set out on a linen-draped table, flanked by wax candles and a bowl of fennel seeds. The bishop turns the pages with 2 fingers. The ink is precise, the gold leaf intact. A fox appears in the margin, chasing a snail. The bishop does not notice. He blesses the book and recommends a new copy for the king's chapel. The book is removed and returned to its case. It is never read again. In the afternoons, the noble woman walks the colonnade with her maid. Her slippers are fur-lined, her shoulders draped with a mantle fastened by an amethyst brooch. They do not speak. Their steps echo faintly between the columns. A gardener bows as they pass. He is pruning the rosemary bush by the fountain. The scent rises as he cuts it. She breathes it in and says nothing. The maid follows. There's music in the evening, but not always for joy. A harp is brought in, strung with gut and polished to a mirror sheen. A blind man plays it deliberately, with slow hands. No one claps. Clapping is for the common feasts. Here, music is more like fragrance noticed, then forgotten. Something to fill the space between candle lighting and sleep. At night, the noble woman returns to her room. The fire is already lit. The bed has been turned down, the sheets warmed with a brick wrapped in wool. On the small table beside her, a psalter rests unopened. Its cover is carved ivory, inset with garnets. The candles burn low. She places her hand on the cover of the book, not to open it, but to feel its cool weight. Then, slowly, she lies down. The maid removes her slippers, dims the lamp, and steps backward toward the door. The room is silent. The cushions sigh as they settle. The ivory glows softly beside the bed. She dreams of things she has never seen. A narrow chapel on the edge of a hill. A garden filled with ink bottles. A pair of hands stained black, shaping the letter again and again in a flickering pool of candlelight. In the morning, she will rise. The bread will be thin again. The civet oil will be laid out beside the rose water. The letters will arrive folded, stamped unopened. The books will wait. The bells will ring. And she will move once more through a palace built not for urgency, but for permanence. Outside the palace, beyond the gardens and the hedges and the orchard rows, the monks are already at their desks. One trims a quill. One stirs the ink. One writes a line from the Gospel of Luke and pauses before the next. The chamber was quiet, but not silent. It was the kind of room designed for thought, not deep thought, perhaps, but thought dressed in velvet. The walls were hung with heavy wool tapestries depicting biblical stories in which every figure looked vaguely royal. The colors had faded to soft browns and reds, the threads curling at the edges like aging fruit peels. Still, they gave the impression of warmth, and more importantly, they gave the impression of wealth. A harp leaned in the corner, untouched. A stack of vellum rested on a carved oak table, perfectly square. The ink pot had not been opened in 3 weeks, but the seal remained unbroken. No one would suspect disuse. This was the writing room of the noblewoman. She used it often, just not for writing. Today, the room smelled faintly of lavender and beeswax polish. The window had been open for less than an hour, letting in a brief gust of spring. The maid had shut it again once the wind scattered 2 loose leaves across the floor. Foreign leaves, sent from an estate farther south, where the trees bloomed early, and the nobleman had a small orchard maintained for show. The leaves were not swept up. They lay quietly now in opposite corners of the rug, as if unsure of what they were doing here. The noble woman sat at the desk. Before her, parchment, a silver penknife, a folded letter unopened, a wax seal bearing a crest she recognized but did not feel anything about. To the left, a small bowl of rose-colored almonds. To the right, a shallow dish of dried apple slices. These had been placed out of habit, not appetite. She touched neither. She began writing not a letter, precisely, but something like a beginning. The ink moved cleanly on the page. She wrote slowly, as if she were walking across an unfamiliar room in the dark, avoiding furniture she wasn't entirely sure existed. To the Lady Judith of East Francia, in courtesy, I send you greetings on this feast of the Apostle Thomas. The almond trees have not yet bloomed here, though I am told. She paused. The pen hovered. Then, without finishing the sentence, She began another line beneath it. I wonder, do your peacocks sing, or only shimmer? She stared at the words for a long time, then reached for the penknife and scraped both lines gently from the page. The parchment hissed softly. A few curled shavings floated down to the table like skin from an old fruit. She blew on the surface and began again. To the Lady Judith, I send nothing. I have no news. The lilies returned. The kitchen roof is mended. My brother remains unwed. The Emperor's mood is unchanged. The Psalter smells of dust. She smiled faintly, as if the room had whispered something slightly inappropriate. She did not send this letter either. It joined the others folded but unsealed in the drawer of her desk, beside scraps of blank parchment and a broken stylus that had belonged, she thought, to someone else. The letters were never meant to arrive. They were not written to inform, or persuade, or seduce. They were a performance with no audience, a ceremony of self addressed to no one in particular. Words for the shape of words. She liked it that way. Elsewhere in the palace, letters were handled with more purpose. Messengers came and went daily, wrapped in cloaks that bore traces of 6 or 7 other courts. They delivered stiff rolls of Latin diplomacy, inked threats and careful gifts, painted icons, tokens carved from amber, jars of imported honey. Scribes copied each one in triplicate, fanned them to dry by the fire, and passed them upward through the proper hands. Nobles opened them with knives shaped like daggers and read them aloud as if meaning arrived with performance. And then, of course, they responded, but not always with truth. More often with what was expected. More often with what had already been written, in some form, a dozen times before. In the chapel, a bishop once declared that words sent by God come not in parchment, but in silence. This was met with polite murmurs. Back in her chamber, she placed a fresh piece of parchment on the desk and began again. Dearest Dash, she paused. The word startled her, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was unpracticed. Who in her world received such a word? Who among the silken shadows of the palace, with their brushed hair and careful phrases, had ever been called dear? The only person who might have been an old friend from her first convent had not written in 5 years, or perhaps it was 6. That friend had loved to press petals between the pages of her prayer book. She had once said that the scent of crushed lavender between parchment was better than anything preserved in ink. The noblewoman remembered this suddenly, with sharp clarity, and wrote, I kept one of your petals. It left a mark in Psalm 42. It still smells like sleep. She stopped again. She had not meant to say that, but the words had arrived as if carried by something small and winged. She folded the parchment, then unfolded it, then folded it again. The letter joined the others in the drawer. Outside in the gallery, a servant dusted niche where a bronze bust had been placed, but never named. The feather brush moved gently over the ridged hair of the sculpture. The servant did not wonder who it was. It was not their place. But as they moved the cloth across the marble sill, they paused. Someone recently had left a single almond there uncracked. They removed it carefully, with 2 fingers, and placed it into their apron without comment. Back in the writing chamber, the noblewoman poured herself a little wine, not because she wanted to drink it, but because the cup, shaped from thin glass, had been made in Venice and designed for display. She held it up to the light, admired how the liquid glowed like early dusk, and set it back down untouched. The act was enough. She wrote no more that day. Instead, she stood at the window and watched the courtyard shift through late afternoon. A dog wandered across the flagstones, one of the Emperor's hounds, half asleep, dragging a paw. 2 servants carried a basket between them, though it looked empty. A gust of wind stirred the peacock feathers into motion. In the far corner, beneath the pear tree, something small and silver caught the light. She could not tell what it was. She did not try to. Later, when the candles were lit and the bell for vespers had long since passed, She returned to the drawer. She removed the latest letter, smoothed it, and placed it into a new bundle tied with blue thread. It joined the others in the chest at the foot of the bed. The chest was not locked, but no one opened it, not even the maid. When she died, years later, the chest was moved without ceremony. The letters were discovered, unread, unsent, unaddressed. A few were copied by a court scribe, filed into the family archive beneath land grants and dowry lists. The rest were burned. The parchment curled, smoked, blackened. But for a moment, just before ash the ink turned gold, there was a robe that required 3 men to lift. It hung in the emperor's private dressing chamber, suspended from an iron hook shaped like a lion's jaw. Most days it was not worn, only dusted. The robe was too heavy for walking, too ornate for warmth, too fragile for use. Its value was, therefore, unquestionable. It had been sewn in Constantinople, though no one quite remembered when it arrived by ship, mule, and flattery. The silk was deep blue, embroidered with twin eagles and gold thread, the wings so finely stitched they seemed to shiver when the light shifted. Tiny pearls ringed the cuffs, and the hem had been stiffened with interlacing wire to maintain its shape in photographs that did not yet exist. No one touched it unless instructed. When the emperor entered the room, it was already prepared. He did not put it on himself. That task fell to 2 silent attendants, who moved with the delicacy of men carrying glass filled to the brim. One lifted the sleeves. One arranged the train. The emperor raised his arm slowly, like a priest before the altar, and allowed the garment to descend around him. It made a sound as it settled. A sigh, perhaps, or the faint hush of heavy fabric meeting colder air. Beneath the robe, he wore a lighter tunic, soft linen, with crimson piping, smooth against the skin. The robe never touched his flesh directly. It was a symbol, not a sensation. The room was quiet as they dressed him. A long mirror stood nearby, slightly warped with age. Its silvering faded at the corners. He rarely looked into it. He already knew what the robe looked like. He had seen it for years. And besides, mirrors could not reflect what mattered. Only applause could do that. The ceremony that day was small. A feast for a visiting count from the marches. There would be handshakes, scripted words, perhaps the gifting of a hunting falcon. Nothing dramatic. Still, the robe would be worn, not because it was needed, but because it would be noticed. In the hall, everything was in place. Candles were arranged by height, not utility. The tablecloths had been embroidered with foreign flowers, some of which did not grow in this climate. A platter of pears had been lacquered to shine, though they would not be eaten. The harpist had rehearsed a new piece variation of a theme from Aquitaine, though the count was partially deaf and more interested in his own echo than in music. This was the nature of status. You built rituals around nothing, so the nothing would look valuable. When the emperor entered, no one clapped. Not immediately. First they stood, not in reverence exactly, more in choreography. A standing body was harder to ignore. And if everyone stood, then everyone was also observed. Then, after a few seconds of stillness, a slow rhythm of polite noise began. It was not real applause, just sound, measured, safe, temporary. The emperor inclined his head, not a bow, just a small tilt. He did not smile. His expression remained still, bearing the weight of expectation without effort. The robe shimmered under the candelabras. No one spoke of the robe, but everyone saw it. Later, when the guests sat, the emperor remained standing. His chair had been prepared, a tall back seat with red velvet cushions and a footstool shaped like a lion. But he did not sit. The robe did not sit well. Its folds resisted compression. Its pearls threatened to crack. The golden hem creaked faintly when bent. So he stood. He sipped water from a goblet carved from rock crystal. He nodded at comments. He asked nothing. He offered presence, and presence was the highest gift. The count gave a speech about borders and loyalty and shared faith. The emperor nodded again. The robe gleamed. In a small alcove off the hall, A servant stood watching through a narrow archway. She had polished the goblets that morning, laid the bread in curls, brushed the peacock feathers for the centerpiece. She did not understand Latin, nor did she need to. She had seen this ceremony 6 times before. It changed nothing, but it filled the day. And so she watched. Her eyes drifted from the emperor's still form to the sleeves of the robe, which brushed the floor. One thread had come loose. She wondered if anyone would notice. She wondered what they would do if it snagged. She wondered how many robes one man could wear without becoming a statue. The feast continued. Courses arrived in silence-roasted quail, almond paste, candied plums. Few ate with hunger. Most ate with intent, to show taste, to perform satisfaction, to occupy the mouth when no one had anything new to say. At the end, a scroll was presented ornate, red-sealed, unread. The emperor held it gently, then passed it to the steward without glancing. He would not read it, but he had received it, and that was the ritual. After the guests retired, the robe was removed, again without words, again by the same 2 attendants. It made the same sound as it lifted a soft exhale, as if the fabric had held its breath. Beneath, the emperor's linen tunic was damp with sweat. He did not change immediately. He sat, at last, on the velvet-cushioned chair. He removed a ring from his finger and rolled it slowly between thumb and forefinger. He looked, not at the mirror, but at the wall. On the wall hung a tapestry. In it, Christ walked barefoot through dust, surrounded by fishermen. Their feet were calloused. Their hands bore nets. They were not wearing robes. The emperor stood again. His attendants folded the robe and placed it in a cedar chest. They would dust it the next day. They always did. Even robes that were never worn gathered dust. Even symbols needed maintenance. Some weeks later, a visitor arrived from a monastery at Tours. A gift was presented. A psalter, copied in small, clear script. The cover was simple leather, worn smooth, but the pages inside were precise, luminous, breathing. The emperor received it without ceremony. He turned to the opening psalm. The ink was brown-black, the margins clean. At the bottom of the page, just beneath Beatus Vir, a rabbit had been drawn in the corner. It held a spear. Its eyes were round and defiant. The emperor smiled. Then he closed the book. He did not ask who had drawn it. Some things were better without names. That night, before bed, the emperor walked through the empty hall alone. The candles had been extinguished. The robe hung again from its hook. He passed it without touching. He sat at the window, unadorned, and listened to the wind move through the arches. He did not speak, but the silence said enough. The feast was already over before it began. Not in the practical sense platters were still being arranged, bread still sliced with geometric precision, but in the deeper, more predictable rhythm of ritual. The outcome was assured, the compliments pre-measured, the music scheduled to end just as the final course touched the linen. Even the applause, should it arise, had been planned with practiced spontaneity. This was not a celebration. This was architecture, a construction of etiquette, borrowed language, and acceptable silences. A performance for no one in particular, staged in a hall where meaning had long since faded into repetition. Still, the chairs were polished, the wine cooled, and the roasted birds, garnished with sugared fruit, stood at attention. This was how the court marked time. The emperor was not present. Not yet. He would arrive 20 minutes late, precisely. Not as an accident, but as punctuation. His absence was not absence. It was permission for the others to settle into their proper shapes composed, cautious, aware of who they were, and more importantly, of who they were not. A young noble coughed delicately into a linen handkerchief embroidered with bees. An older count removed his gloves finger by finger, then set them in perfect alignment beside his plate, as if preparing a scene of polite resignation. A bishop adjusted his sleeves and examined the underside of his goblet, pretending not to notice that no one had yet poured the wine. All waited. The waiting was part of the feast. The hall itself was beautiful in the way old stone is beautiful, not because it tries to impress, but because it has forgotten how not to exist. High windows let in the low, filtered light of late afternoon. Their stained glass had dulled over time, each saint's face smudged by sun and smoke, their expressions softened into polite confusion. The flagstones beneath the table had been scrubbed with wine vinegar and crushed thyme. They smelled faintly of sour bread and wet wood. The candles burned with a clean, slow flame. Everything was ready. At last, the emperor entered, not with fanfare, just a hush that rippled gently down the table, like wind moving through wheat. Everyone stood. He nodded. Everyone sat. The meal began. It always began the same way. A servant poured water into a silver basin for the emperor to wash his hands, though he rarely touched the water. A platter of loaves was carried in sourdough, braided, stamped with seals. Beside it, a dish of salt arranged in a careful spiral. No one would touch the spiral. It was ornamental, like much of the food. A goose followed, stuffed with almonds and apples, its wings glazed and outstretched as if in mid-flight. The emperor did not look at it. He selected a slice of bread, tasted it, nodded, and the rest began to eat. The noblewoman, seated 4 places to the emperor's right, reached for a spoon. The bowl before her contained a cream of leeks, sprinkled with grated nutmeg. She tasted it. It was neither good nor bad, just correct. Across from her, a man she had met twice before spoke softly of river tolls. She nodded, once, then returned to her spoon. Further down the table, a boy of about 12 newly arrived from the south stared too long at a platter of apricots carved into the shape of lilies. His hand twitched toward one. The servant beside him coughed, almost imperceptibly. The hand withdrew. The apricots remained whole. Beauty, after all, was not meant to be disturbed. The wine was poured in stages. First for the emperor, then, in descending order of consequence. Each cup was silver, engraved with different family insignias. Some were so old they had outlived the families themselves. Others were so new they still held the scent of molten metal. The emperor sipped once, and then placed his cup down with a sound just loud enough to be registered. The others followed suit. Conversation was quiet, almost ornamental. Topics included the weather in Lombardy, the shipment of new tapestries from Alls, the death of a lesser duke whose name had already faded by desert. No one laughed. No one frowned. They spoke with the evenness of monks reciting familiar psalms not out of devotion, but habit. The harpist played 3 notes too many. The emperor did not flinch, but a steward stepped forward, paused, and stood beside the musician until the music gently faded into stillness. No one mentioned it, but the silence that followed carried the shape of correction. By the 3rd course, custard molded in the form of the imperial crest was brought forward. It had taken 6 hours to prepare. No one touched it. They admired it, then allowed it to be removed. Some things were too perfect to eat, or too absurd. A servant passed near the emperor, carrying a folded letter, sealed in blue wax. He took it, placed it beneath his plate, did not read it. It would be read later, or not at all. But the act of receiving it, of holding sealed language in the presence of bread and gold, was part of the feast. It reminded the others that words still moved, even if they were not heard. A bowl of figs, perfumed with rosewater, circulated without much interest. A nobleman dropped a spoon. A priest pretended not to notice a servant with mismatched shoes. The tapestry behind the high table fluttered faintly. No window was open, but the movement, like so much in the court, went unexplained. At the end, the emperor rose. Not abruptly, not fully, just enough for the others to begin their own slow unfolding. He left through a side door, his cloak trailing softly behind him. The applause was late, half-hearted, and brief. The hall emptied. The chairs were reset, the platters removed, the candles trimmed and replaced. The air returned to its normal weight, and in a corner of the room, near the bishop's seat. A single apricot lily remained untouched, its edges beginning to darken. That night, the emperor walked the garden alone. The scent of rosemary followed his steps. Above, the stars blinked with indifferent precision. He paused near the fountain, sat on the cold bench, and held the sealed letter in his hands. He did not open it, but he turned it over, again and again, between his fingers. The wax bore a crest he recognized, the same hand that had written once before, a note that had said, "The Psalter smells of dust." He smiled, and placed the letter in the folds of his cloak. Tomorrow the robe would be aired, the candles replaced, the linen pressed, and the apricots carved anew. And now the candles have burned low, the ink is dried, and the quiet footsteps of the past begin to fade again into silence. We've wandered together through cold stone corridors and soft parchment pages, through the hush of a scriptorium where words were written not for glory, but for memory and for care. And those centuries have passed since those quiet hands traced letters. By lamplight, something of them still lingers. In every book we hold, in every pause between thoughts, there is the faintest echo of those who came before us. Not loudly, not with urgency, but with a kind of gentle patience that reminds us we are part of something long and slow and beautifully unfinished. Perhaps your world tonight is lit not by oil lamp, but by screen. Perhaps the silence around you is the hush before sleep, or the quiet pause before another day begins. Wherever you are, if this story has brought you a little peace, or helped you breathe more softly, you are warmly invited to like, or share, or subscribe for more. But only if it feels right. Only if you'd like to return to this little pocket of stillness again. And if you'd like to leave a comment, telling us where you're listening from, or what time it is there, you'd be most welcome. For now, rest well, dream gently, and come back tomorrow for another story whispered softly from the pages of time.